Have you been sitting in that quiet, the kind of quiet that only happens after everyone else has gone home, and asking yourself, where did I go wrong? Maybe your son stopped returning your calls 6 months ago. Maybe your daughter sent you a message that said she needed space, and that space has turned into 2 years of silence. Maybe you found out from someone else that your grandchildren had a birthday party, and you weren't invited. If that's where you are right now, I want you to know something before we go any further. You are not alone. And you are not the monster your silence has been making you feel like. I've spent more than 40 years working as a clinical psychologist, sitting across from parents, good, loving, imperfect, real parents, who were drowning in exactly the kind of guilt and confusion you may be feeling right now. And in all those years, one of the most painful things I've witnessed isn't the estrangement itself. It's what parents do to themselves in the aftermath. The way they quietly convict themselves. The way they replay every argument, every missed school play, every harsh word from 30 years ago, and build a case against themselves that no jury would ever accept. Today I want to offer you something different. Not false comfort. Not empty reassurance. But 5 clinically grounded reasons why your child's estrangement does not make you a failed parent. Stay with me. Because by the end of this video, I think you're going to see your story and yourself a little differently. Before we get to those 5 reasons, I need to share something with you, a truth that I've had to tell many parents before I could begin to help them heal. According to researchers at the University of Cambridge who have studied family estrangement extensively, an estimated 27% of families in the United States experience some form of estrangement between parents and adult children. That's more than 1 in 4 families. You are not an anomaly. You are not a cautionary tale. You are part of a vast, largely invisible group of parents who are suffering in silence because estrangement carries a stigma that other family griefs do not. When a spouse dies, people bring casseroles. When a child is estranged, people go quiet. They don't know what to say. And so the parent is left alone, not just with the loss, but with the assumption that they must have done something to deserve it. That assumption is what I want to dismantle today. The developmental psychologist Erik Erikson described the final stage of life as a tension between integrity and despair. Integrity, the sense that your life, with all its imperfections, was meaningful and worthy. Despair, the feeling that you've run out of time to correct your mistakes and that your life adds up to nothing. Estrangement, when it's not put in proper context, can push a parent straight into despair. And that is a tragedy I am not willing to sit by and watch happen. So let's begin. Reason 1. Adult children make their own choices, and that's by design. I want to introduce you to someone I'll call Margaret. Margaret came to see me when she was 68 years old. Her daughter, a woman in her early 40s, had stopped speaking to her approximately 3 years before our first session. No dramatic confrontation. No final argument. Just a slow withdrawal, until one day Margaret realized she hadn't heard her daughter's voice in 4 months. In our first session, Margaret said something I've heard echoed by dozens of parents. I must have done something terribly wrong because my daughter is a strong woman. She doesn't make decisions lightly. I asked her to sit with that sentence for a moment, to really hear it. My daughter is a strong woman. She doesn't make decisions lightly. Where did that strength come from? Margaret had raised her daughter largely on her own. She'd worked 2 jobs after her divorce. She had taught her daughter to be self-reliant, to trust her own instincts, to not stay in situations that caused her harm. And now her daughter was doing exactly that. Now, I am not saying her daughter's decision was the right one. That is not the point I am making. The point I am making is this. One of the signs of successful parenting is raising a child who is capable of making independent decisions. The psychologists Edward D.C. and Richard Ryan spent decades studying what they called self-determination theory, the idea that human beings are wired with a deep, innate need for autonomy, to choose their own path, to act from their own values, not someone else's expectations. When you raised a child who grew into an adult capable of making hard choices, even choices that hurt you, you were doing your job. I'm not asking you to celebrate the estrangement. I'm asking you to separate the outcome from the evidence. Your child's capacity for independent action is not proof that you failed. In many ways, it is proof that you succeeded. Reason 2. Family systems are complex. No single person causes estrangement. One of the most dangerous things about guilt is how it simplifies. When we feel responsible for something painful, our minds want a clean story. I did X. X caused Y. I am to blame. Simple, linear, and completely wrong when it comes to families. In the 1950s and 60s, the psychiatrist Murray Bowen developed what we now call Bowen family systems theory. And the core insight of his work, the thing that changed how an entire generation of therapists thought about families, is this: families are emotional systems, not collections of individuals. What happens in a family is not caused by one person. It emerges from the interactions, the histories, the patterns, and the pressures that every member contributes, often without knowing it. Bowen described a process he called emotional cutoff, the way individuals manage the anxiety of unresolved family tension by distancing themselves physically or emotionally. And here is the critical thing: emotional cutoff is a response to systemic tension, not to one parent's behavior. Think about your family as Margaret eventually learned to think about hers. There were grandparents with their own unresolved wounds. There were dynamics in Margaret's own marriage, and later, her divorce, that shaped the emotional atmosphere her daughter grew up in. There was a son-in-law whose own family history affected how he viewed in-laws. There was a therapist her daughter had been seeing who, with the best intentions, encouraged her to identify sources of stress in her life. Every one of these factors contributed to where Margaret and her daughter ended up. None of this means you have no responsibility for your part in the relationship. It means that your part is a part, not the whole. When you say, "I caused this estrangement," you are taking on a burden that doesn't belong entirely to you. And you are, paradoxically, giving yourself more power over the situation than any one person actually has. Families are complex. Estrangement is almost always the result of many forces converging over many years. You were one voice in a much larger conversation. Reason 3. Your child's pain is real, but it doesn't automatically mean you were abusive. This is the reason I have to deliver most carefully, because it touches something tender on both sides of the estrangement. Your adult child's pain is real. I am not asking you to dismiss it, minimize it, or argue with it. If your son or daughter carries wounds from childhood, from moments they felt unseen, unheard, or unsupported, those wounds are real. Feelings don't require factual accuracy to cause genuine suffering. But here is the clinical distinction I need you to understand. There is a significant difference between imperfect parenting and abusive parenting. Every parent on earth, every single one, was imperfect. Every parent was sometimes too tired, too distracted, too overwhelmed, too scared to give their child exactly what that child needed in a particular moment. That is the human condition. That is not abuse. Margaret remembered a moment her daughter had brought up in a letter, one of the last communications between them. Her daughter had written, "You never really listened to me when I was a teenager. You were always too busy." And Margaret sat in my office holding that letter and she cried. Not defensively. She cried because she knew it was partly true. She had been busy, exhausted, barely keeping the lights on and food on the table while working 2 jobs as a single mother. She had not been the emotionally available mother she wished she could have been. But had she been neglectful? Had she been cruel? Had she ever raised a hand or destroyed her daughter's sense of self-worth intentionally? No. She had been a woman in an impossible situation, doing the best she could with what she had. The Harvard Study of Adult Development, one of the longest-running studies of human life in history, tracking individuals for over 80 years, found something profound. The quality of our relationships is the single greatest predictor of long-term well-being. But it also found that relationships are almost never permanently damaged by ordinary human imperfection. They are damaged by consistent, intentional patterns of harm. Being imperfect is not the same as being harmful. Your child's pain deserves compassion, and so does yours. Reason 4. Silence is not always abandonment. Sometimes it's self-protection. When a child cuts off contact with a parent, our instinct, especially as the parent, is to interpret that silence as punishment, as a judgment, as the final word on who we are and what we deserve. But clinical experience tells a more nuanced story. In many cases, adult children who go no contact are not doing it to punish their parents. They are doing it because they have reached a point where the emotional cost of maintaining contact feels greater than they can manage. They are protecting their own nervous system, their own marriage, their own mental health. I want to be clear. I am not telling you their choice was the right one. I am not telling you the pain it causes you doesn't matter. It does, profoundly. What I am telling you is that their silence does not necessarily mean what you think it means. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps and went on to found logotherapy, wrote that the last of human freedoms is the freedom to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that people under extreme emotional pressure make choices that seem incomprehensible to those on the outside. Your child is under a kind of pressure you may not fully see. And the silence they've chosen, as painful as it is to receive, may have far more to do with their own internal landscape than with a considered verdict on your parenting. This doesn't resolve the grief, but it can begin to release you from the false conviction that the silence is proof of your failure. Silence is not always a sentence. Sometimes, it is simply a door that has not yet opened. Reason 5. How you parented is not the only variable in this equation. I want to say something that may surprise you, coming from a psychologist. Your parenting, whatever its strengths and weaknesses, is not the only variable that determine the relationship you have with your adult child today. We are living through a cultural moment unlike any previous generation has experienced. The adult children of today, whether they are in their 30s, 40s, or even 50s, came of age in a world that gave them frameworks and language for their emotional experiences that simply did not exist when you were raising them. The language of toxic relationships. The concept of setting boundaries. The cultural encouragement to prioritize one's own mental health above relational obligation. The rise of individual therapy as the primary lens through which many people now interpret their childhood. None of these things are inherently bad. But they have created a cultural context in which cutting off a parent has become, for some people, not a last resort, but an early option, a socially validated act of self-care. I have spoken with parents whose estrangement began because their adult child's therapist encouraged them to remove negative influences, and the parent ended up on that list, not because of any specific harm, but because of accumulated friction that might, in an earlier era, have been worked through with a difficult conversation. You raised your children in one world. They are navigating their emotional lives in a very different one. That generational and cultural gap is not your fault. You could not have prepared for it because it didn't exist yet. What this means is that even if you had been a near-perfect parent, the current cultural moment might still have produced some version of the distance you're experiencing. The variables at play are far larger than any single family. This is not an excuse for genuine harm. But for the vast majority of parents I have worked with, genuine harm is not the issue. The issue is a collision between generations, expectations, cultures, and emotional frameworks, and you are bearing the cost of that collision as if it were entirely your creation. It is not. Let me return to Margaret for a moment. When we ended our work together, after about 18 months of sessions, her daughter had not come back. There was no reconciliation, no letter of apology, no phone call on Christmas morning, but something had changed profoundly. Margaret had stopped holding an ongoing trial against herself. She had stopped treating every memory of her parenting as potential evidence for the prosecution. She had allowed herself to see the whole of what she had given her daughter, the sacrifices, the love, the school pickups, the birthday cakes made from scratch, the nights she sat up worrying, without dismissing any of it. She told me, in our final session, I think I'm ready to let this be what it is, instead of what I'm afraid it means. That is the work. Not forgetting. Not giving up hope that things might one day change, but refusing to let the estrangement write the final sentence of your story. If you are in the early stages of grief around this, Here are 3 things I would ask you to consider. First, stop the internal trial. You are not a fair judge of yourself right now. The guilt is too loud. Give yourself the grace of suspended judgment until you can see more clearly. Second, seek support outside the family. A therapist, a support group for estranged parents, a trusted friend who can hold the complexity of this with you without rushing you toward easy answers. You should not carry this alone. Third, invest in the life that is in front of you. I know that sounds almost cruel when you are grieving someone who is still alive. But Erik Erikson was right. The work of this stage of life is integrity. Looking at your life and finding in it, not perfection, but meaning. Your child's absence does not empty your life of meaning. It creates a wound. But you are more than that wound. If there is one thing I hope you carry with you when this video ends, it is this. Estrangement is one chapter. It is not the final verdict on your life's work. You raised a human being in an imperfect world, with imperfect tools, under pressures that most people never saw. You made mistakes, because all parents do. And you also gave more than anyone will ever fully count. The fact that your child has chosen distance does not erase what you built. It does not revoke the love you gave. It does not transform years of sacrifice into evidence of failure. You are not on trial. And if some part of you needed to hear that today, if you came to this video carrying something heavy, I hope it feels even just slightly lighter now. Before you go, I have a question for you, and I'd love for you to answer it in the comments below. Of the 5 reasons we discussed today, which one resonated with you most deeply? Just type the number 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Your answer helps me understand what you're going through, and it helps other parents in this community feel less alone when they see they're not the only one. If this video reached something real in you, please share it with another parent who needs to hear it. Sometimes the most healing thing we can do is simply say to someone, "You are not as alone in this as you feel." I'll be back next week with a video on what to do when an estranged child reaches back out after years of silence, and why your response in that moment matters more than you might think. Until then, take care of yourself. You deserve that. You always have.